Thank you for tuning into the Devy Devotional Podcast, a monthly show focusing on Devy prospects, strategies, and incoming rookies. Now here's your host.
Welcome in to the Devy Devotional, where we stay devoted to Devy. I'm your host, Dynasty Coach A, joined as always by Aaron at Aaron Wilcox86 on Twitter. And tonight we're going to be answering your questions, the listener mailbag pod. When we've run out of ideas, we get your ideas and then we run with them. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight. We have some good ones. We got some good ones from some of our friends. I wish we got some other ones from other listeners. I know you guys are listening. I see the numbers on the pod, but hopefully we'll get some more of those next time. We did get some good ones though. And let me just ask you, Aaron, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, thanks. And yes, excited to answer these questions. And maybe we'll have to do one more later in the off season and just try to get even more questions answered. So hopefully there will be even more next time, but I'm excited for the ones that we do have today.
Absolutely. So, I mean, is there anything you want to discuss? Any news and notes or anything like that going on in the Devy or C2C world right now that, or before we dive into some questions of, pertaining to all that kind of good stuff?
Yeah. Evening, by the way, Dave. Dave's in our chat there. We always love that. So appreciate you, Dave. But nothing big that I wanted to get to notes wise. Like there's some interesting battles going on, but that is one of the listener questions for tonight. So stay tuned for that one. I don't know that we want to lead off with that, but I think a great one to lead off with was friend of the show at FF_Dirty Mike on Twitter. He asked us, how did you guys start to team up together? I assume that he's talking just this podcast. And the way that we really met was through a fantasy football league. I just decided to start one up and a bunch of random guys on Twitter hopped on. And that's kind of how John and myself met. We started playing in that league and that morphed into John's success with the happy hour that he runs. So every Friday, a bunch of people get together and just talk about all things life, football, otherwise. So I guess a lot of things have morphed from that initial league, which is really cool. But yeah, that's how we got to know each other. And then we decided let's just start doing some podcast stuff. And along the way here, we morphed into the Devy Devotional.
Yeah, I mean that's the very quick way of saying it. It's kind of crazy when you think about it because I've met some great people on Twitter. I've met some not so great people on Twitter, but I really do feel like that initial happy hour group was just so many people that love talking about fantasy football or just talking about football in general or whatever. And a lot of podcasts came from that group. A lot of people are still talking and doing things fantasy football related. So it's really cool. 2-3 years later, it's actually 3 years now since we joined that league and started happy hour. But what's cool, what's hilarious is, if people don't remember, if they weren't here from pod 1 or the first couple of pods, I wasn't even in a Devy league when we first started this podcast. I had never been in a Devy league. I had never been in the C2C league. I didn't watch college football. I truly was I love talking about fantasy football and all that kind of stuff. And I knew that Aaron and then the original co-host Duchesne's at Duchesne's_ on Twitter, he would, they talked and they knew college football. And so I was willing to just be the host and just ask them certain questions. And I tried to bring it back to a dynasty mindset and stuff like that. And I felt like I did a good job with that. But then of course I dove into Devy and I created Devy Beth. And, next thing you know, now I'm in Devy leagues, C2C leagues, and I'm able to actually like sit here and have conversations about it. But 2 years ago when we started this podcast, I had no idea what I was talking about when it came to this stuff. And it really is kind of crazy how it's evolved over time. And of course, Duchesne's stepped away because he got busier with life, marriage, and a new job and all that kind of stuff. And now it's Aaron and I.
Absolutely. So nice question there, Mike. And since we're already on Mike's questions, let's get to another one. And we will get through all the ones submitted on Twitter, but his might as well just, since we're on that topic already, get to his second question. At what point in time are you out on a prospect? So I'll let you go first, John. What are your thoughts with when you're out on a guy?
I think I'm out a lot sooner than you are, but you can get into that here in a little bit. I'm ready to be out even in like a supplemental draft. When I feel like a player's jumped the shark, people just start getting overly hyped about them. Now, I'm not saying that I've even done that or anything like that, but I just know in my mindset, it's anytime in Dynasty, anytime I feel like somebody's overvalued, I'm ready to be out. That doesn't mean that I'm ready to just be like, oh well, I'm selling them for a third. Like obviously I want proper value, but I'm ready to be out on a player if I feel like I can gain value and whether it's in another player, another pick, or whatever it might be, or a combination of the two. But I mean, I guess to answer the question probably more properly, it would be once I see them fail expectations that first year, like a Luther Burden or a player like that, then I'm ready to be out on them because as long as people are still willing to still be in and like all in, especially in like a Luther Burden. And that's why you'll hear me and Aaron talk about him so much, is because people still have Burden at like wide receiver 3 in the class or wide receiver 3 overall in Devy. And I get that anything can happen, anything can and will happen. He could take that giant leap forward, but he has to take a giant leap forward, and that's why I need him to do that, and I'm willing to just be out on the player. That doesn't mean that he couldn't possibly get better or anything like that. It just means that I'm willing to sell him at price. So I guess that's the easiest way to say is once after that first year, if I thought, okay, he's going to be a top 10 wide receiver going into year 2, and I have him as a top 15 wide receiver going into year 2, then I'm probably willing to be out. And it's not just wide receivers, obviously any position. I'm ready. What about you?
Yeah, and I will preface this by saying it might be slightly different in Devy versus C2C because sometimes guys who just maybe they're not quite NFL caliber, they can still be very relevant in C2C leagues for their college production. But let's just say in general, we're talking Devy. I I jokingly thought about this saying never. I'm never out on a prospect until we've seen them declare it and get the final body of work. Just because it's easy to get out on them early, especially when you compare it to, like you mentioned, Luther Burden, still priced very highly as if he had broken out already. But it's one season in. I just don't think that when we're looking at these guys, usually it's 3 seasons worth of data at this point, it's easy to say out, but I don't think that we can rule out huge improvements out of guys. So ultimately, there's always those players who rise significantly and take that giant leap, as unlikely as it seemed. Like Jamison Williams, I mean, he was dead. He was not relevant at all until he was. Or Bo Nix. It took him, what, his 4th season in a different team and being hardly drafted in deep C2C leagues, and he had a huge leap. So I don't think never is probably the right answer with that, but I think that we always have to reserve a little hope. Whether we attach a lot of value to them is another thing. So I mean, I wasn't advocating for drafting Bo Nix early last year by any means, but sometimes I still hold out hope. But for every year that they don't produce, then we have to kind of fade them more and more and more. So a guy who comes to
Right.
mind is like Raheem Jarrett, for example, Maryland wide receiver. He declared
I was
this.
just going to say Parker Washington.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, it's exciting to see some flashes as a freshman, but if they just never improve on that as time goes on, you kind of have to start to become more and more out, never ruling out that there's those outliers who really, really do make a big jump in their junior or senior seasons.
Yeah, and that's like, I mean, I kind of have Jared and Washington in similar tiers, so it's kind of the same, like same player, like overly hyped, didn't do all that much. Even going into year 2, didn't take that big leap that we were hoping for, and that's kind of my point. Is obviously there are the Jameson Williams and players like that, but for every one of those, there's probably what 10 that didn't do that didn't take that leap. And that's why I'm willing to just be out, because with the Jameson Williams, if you were hyped, like Ohio State wide receiver, linked to a great quarterback, all that kind of stuff, and then you saw year 1 that he doesn't do anything, and then year 2 he doesn't do anything. If you had sold him, if he was still being hyped after year 1, it's year 2, now he's going to take that big leap. If you had sold him, I'm pretty sure you could have taken that profit and then gone back and gotten him later on when you did possibly believe in him. Obviously, depending on how quickly you're able to get back to it. But like once he transferred to Alabama, you might be able to take that profit and still go back and get him at that point. But if he didn't do that, if he doesn't take that step, you've already cashed in. You've already done that. And once again, it's not always going to work. It's not always going to be perfect, but that's just kind of how I'm looking at it. Now, once again, I'm not an overly experienced C2C or even Devy player, so maybe I'm wrong, but it's just from what I've seen from a lot of these players and who truly like takes that next step forward. I'm willing to be out after that first year.
Yeah, they make a lot of fair points towards that. And to follow up on the last question that Dirty Mike submitted to us, I appreciate all the questions. He wants to know what's one indicator / metric that we look for in future breakouts. Any thoughts there, John?
Yeah, and obviously it's different depending on the position, but I think all in all, it's going to be, for me at least, it's going to be efficiency metrics. That's going to be the easiest way to say it if we were talking about just for sorry, I didn't have my phone on do not disturb. Now I do. But for QBs, I'm looking at like adjusted yards per attempt and stuff like that, interception rate. I think that they actually have what it takes to be an NFL QB. It doesn't even have to be a huge sample size. And obviously we see things like DJU and players like that, that it doesn't always work out, even if they do have that, but that's what I'm looking for to see. Do I think they could take that next step forward? For running backs, you're looking at like the PPR points per touch and the big time run rate. Do they have that explosiveness? Do they have, are they scoring points when they're touching the ball? And then for wide receivers, I'm really looking at, honestly, I think people just completely dismiss it, but I'm looking at yards per reception. Once again, it's an efficiency thing. Like, are you efficient with the ball when you catch it? Even if you only have 8 receptions that first year, were you efficient with those 8 catches? Were you Josh Downs with, a very small sample, but 3 touchdowns on, however many catches? I can't remember how many he had, but did you have 17 yards per reception and 3 touchdowns, something like that? That can get into the PPR points per touch as well for them. So maybe honestly, when it comes down to all 3 positions, it might even be PPR points per touch. Like, might be if I had to boil it down to one metric, it might be that. Like, that might be the easiest way to look and see, do I think these players can actually take that next step?
Yeah, you hit on a lot of good ones. And I'll say wide receivers too. I mean, yards per team pass attempt, that does take a lot of the efficiency and big play abilities into consideration with that statistic, but it has
Yeah, but
its
unless
drawbacks too.
you unless you're doing it for like Marvin Harrison Jr., unless you're doing it for the one game that he actually like truly stood out or played in, then yeah, maybe you can do it. But if you're looking over the course of a season, he's going to have a terrible yards per team pass attempt, but he
Yes,
has,
yes.
and that's why I'm looking at yards per reception, because that's why we don't look at one metric. When it's all said and done, yards per team pass attempt can be very important, but when you're looking for a small sample size thing, it's not going to show up. And that's why I really do think, now, if we're talking about a junior taking the next step into being, or a sophomore taking the next step into becoming that junior that really truly stands out, maybe you could go with yards per team pass attempt. But I'm thinking more from like a freshman standpoint, or the guy that hasn't truly broken out yet. That's what I was thinking, at least taking the question as the guy that has 200 college career pass or receiving yards. That's not going to show up in yards per team pass attempt.
Yeah, I like a point that you brought up with, let's take maybe a small sample and zoom in, see what they did during that sample if we can. And I like even like a target share type of deal. Just, are they heavily targeted? Are they heavily utilized and dominating inside that offense? And see, okay, what's the issue here? Why didn't they do this all season long? And if you apply the context of whether it's injury, whether it's they just didn't get on the field because they were young, it took a while for the coaching staff to trust them, or maybe it was a quarterback change, something significant like that, really spurred them breaking out. That's very important for us to know. So that's a wide receiver deal. I'll agree with you for sure on running backs. We want efficiency, playmaking ability, all that, and then quarterbacks again, efficiency, yards per pass attempt, and touchdown to interception ratio. Absolutely. So those are metrics, and you hit it exactly when you said we don't want to focus on one, but those are very important things to look at in the grand scheme of things.
100%. I agree. I think that it's for me, when I'm talking about like yards per reception, stuff like that, there might be better ways to look at it if you are looking at each individual player and saying, okay, what's the context behind this player? Why did Marvin Harrison Jr. only have 169 yards or whatever the hell he had that freshman year? Okay, here's context of why. And okay, but as far as my model's concerned, I can't do that. I can't sit there and go through 10 or 3,000 college wide receivers and say, okay, well, this is why this is happening, blah, blah, blah. So I have to do something that's very generalized and that can pick up on small nuances here and there. And so that's where yards per reception really does stand out for the wide receivers at the very least, because it's like, okay, well, this guy that did nothing when he touched the ball, I'm not going to be overly excited about him. But this guy that had this, okay, like what it doesn't have to be yards per reception. It could be like touchdowns. It could be something like that. But those are the things that I'm kind of looking. And that's why I said when it's all said and done, it might actually be PPR points per touch because that's going to have all of that stuff in. It's going to have yardage. It's going to have receptions and it's going to have touchdowns in it. So, it's pretty easy when you boil it down. Like if a guy can score points his freshman year, he could probably score points his sophomore year. He could probably score points in the NFL. Like it's that simple, guys.
There is hope for Luther Burden without you saying so.
No, there is. I mean, there is. He scored touchdowns. Now he did it very inefficiently as far as his receiving work, but he also had the rushing touchdowns. What I think 3 rushing touchdowns and maybe even a punt return touchdown, if I remember correctly. So I mean, he did score touchdowns. I've also seen players like a Terrace Marshall that scored touchdowns and are not very good, So it just because you score touchdowns doesn't mean you can, but it is something that I look at for sure.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Lots of time for these young guys to improve on things. And speaking of a young guy, our friend Crescent at Tui, how do you say that?
209. It's just his area code spelled out. 209.
I actually didn't know that.
Tui?
I've known him for a while, but he asks us, will Archie Manning, so Arch Manning, live up to the hype? Question mark. And I'm going to say yes, but I'm expecting it in 2024. I think he is going to live up to that hype. It's just going to take a while. There's just too much high-end recruit experience and talent ahead of him this year, but they didn't bring him in to just sit long term. Like he's going to play next year, whether that's if Ewers doesn't take a step forward, then Arch replaces him. If Ewers does really well, then he leaves to the draft and Arch Manning replaces him. And unfortunately, for any of the other quarterbacks in that room, you don't bring in Arch Manning and have him sit for 2 years. I just don't see it happening personally.
Yeah, obviously, I've already said I'm out on Quinn Ewers, which goes back to our original question or the second question from Mike talking about when are you out on a prospect, and I said like Ewers sat behind behind CJ Stroud and Kyle McCord and whoever else year one, then he transfers over to Texas, then he gets injured and he doesn't have a great season when he comes back. Then they bring in Arch Manning. I'm ready to be out on Quinn Ewers because he's still being so heavily invested in. People are still saying, oh, he's the guy, like that kind of thing. And he very well could be. But I'm ready to be out because there is that doubt in my mind that could Arch Manning beat him out year one? It is possible. Maybe it's not week 1, maybe it's not week 7, but week 10, like that kind of thing. Then yeah, of course you get a full season now in Devy. That would kill you because at that point, like Ewers is being replaced. He's obviously going to get, his Devy value is just going to completely tank. And C2C probably wouldn't be that terrible because at least you got 10 games out of him, like that kind of thing. But regardless, you're still banking on him for Devy purposes, even in that C2C league. But getting back to Arch, I do believe that he's a Manning. Like he's going to have every opportunity to succeed ever. I mean, literally, like he could probably fail 10 times and they're still going to be like, oh, he's a Manning. It doesn't matter. But I also think that he's a good player. I know he has like a small school sample size out of high school. People are concerned about like the step forward into college football, but I think he's surrounded by a just crap load of talent there in Texas. He has a good coach. Everything really seems like it's right for him to succeed. And so at this point, it's kind of like Aaron said, is it going to be 2023 or is it going to be 2024? Not necessarily that he actually lives up to the hype. I think he will. Now, can he live up to the hype of a Manning? That's a completely different story, but I think that he will live up to the hype of being a very high end college QB at the very least.
Yep, that is all fair there.
Sorry, I was taking a sip of my drink. I thought you were going to have a rebuttal or something.
No, I mean, I'll accept it. And honestly, I think that we differ slightly on the Ewers take. But at the end of the day, the question's all about Arch Manning. And yes, I think he's going to live up to the hype. So good question there, Crescent. Next at FF Tyler O. What players are in a competition right now that stand to gain the most after being the declared starter? So looking for guys who just are going to gain a lot of value once we know that they are for sure their team's starter. And so this pertains to a lot of spring practices. Those are still ongoing. We don't have all the answers yet by any means. And I wrote down a lot of different names, but which ones come to your mind, I guess? Which ones are the highest on your list as far as either interest or maybe the largest amount of value gained if they get declared the starter, John?
Yeah, definitely. And Toronto says, shout out Tyler. Tyler's a part of the happy hour crew. So definitely appreciate the question from him. Well, I mean, I guess we'll start with Arch Manning. If he wins the job, he's going to skyrocket. But although I do not actually think that he wins the job in spring practice or even possibly, I don't even think he wins the job in fall practice. I think it would be in season if Ewers looks like he did from last year. Then Arch could win it. But all joking aside, like, guys like a Garrett Nussmeier, out in LSU, like now I'm a big Jaden Daniels fan. I always have been, but I know there's a lot of hype coming out of spring practice, spring camp, talking about him. He kind of just lost all of his value, I think, last year, just, I don't know. It seems like you didn't hear too many people that are like overly hyped about him anymore. But if he becomes the guy as what, sophomore? Is he a sophomore or junior? I can't remember now, but
Be a junior.
oh, junior. Okay. So as a junior, if he becomes the guy, like technically he could get NFL love at that point, or at the very least he could be a C2C guy for you. I would like to think that Jaden Daniels wins that job, but I think that that's a very easy one that he could just skyrocket in value if he wins that job outright.
Yeah, I really like that one. That wasn't on my list, but I think that's a very important one, and two quarterbacks that I know you care about quite a bit too. So we could go with a lot of quarterbacks on this list. I included the obvious ones, right? Ohio State, Kyle McCord versus Devin Brown, and then also Alabama, Jalen Milroe versus Ty Simpson. And it's hard to know day to day where they stand. Like a lot of these guys, they're just splitting reps. I think that Kyle McCord, at least most of the community is really on board with him being the starter. Whether it pans out that way, I guess it's not completely clear yet, but it seems like McCord has that leg up. Is he going to gain some value? Sure, yeah, but he's definitely valued more so than Devin Brown at this point. And then I see people flip-flopping Jalen Milroe and Ty Simpson value-wise. It's kind of all over the place with them. There's more ambiguity and unknown with them. So maybe the Alabama quarterback gains even more value if you look at how many spots they might jump when they're declared the starter. But those are interesting situations. I guess you could go to another quarterback room in Georgia, Carson Beck, Gunnar Stockton, or the field there. And I know we both like Gunnar Stockton the most. Hoping it ends up being him. That could be a huge value jump for him, though, because I don't hear a lot of people talking about him or drafting him high at all.
Yeah, I mean, it really boils down to all these QB competitions. There's just so many of them that it's so. whoever fails, is just going to completely lose all of their value. Even like Spencer Sanders and Jackson Dart, like that's more for C2C purposes, obviously, but one of those players is going to have value this year, and one of those players is probably not. I guess there's like I heard that Spencer Sanders is only running in spring camps. He hasn't taken a throw, but I guess that's because of an injury or something he had to his shoulder. So that probably explains that away. But if they're just truly going to use him as like a rushing QB and stuff like that, then I guess they technically both could have it. But it's really just boiling down to all of these QB controversies or whatever you want to call it. That there's so many of them. We could probably list off another 20 where guys could really technically skyrocket in value. But if you're just talking about like the main ones, I think you kind of hit on all like the big, truly Devy, ones that are going to jump in value as far as QBs. There's some running backs like Jaden Ott or somebody like that we could, Jaden Blue, all the Jadens. Like we could talk about some of those running backs that obviously, could take a step forward. Branson Robinson is getting first team reps now because Kendall Milton is out with an injury in spring and everything. So like that just gives him another leg forward, even though we already thought that he was going to be great and that he was going to probably be the one this year. Maybe that kind of solidifies it. Like, so he's already getting that value boost, even though he probably didn't even need it. He was already there.
Right. I'm not sure if he's really gaining value, but there's more certainty for sure. Yep. I actually think that under the radar one, or maybe one that we just take for granted, is Michigan. Like you look at Blake Corum versus Donovan Edwards. Blake Corum has had a stranglehold on that job for a while. However, Donovan Edwards, if he actually maybe leapfrogs him, less in the spring, because we know that Corum's working his way back from injury, but let's say in the fall, if he's still number 2, I mean, I guess that really shows how much development has taken place for Donovan Edwards as a runner and as a 3-down back. So that will be very interesting. However, there's the injury deal, right? Did he actually win the job, or is he just the most healthy going into fall camp and then the fall season? So I think that's an interesting running back room. You didn't mention Alabama, or at least I missed it if you did, but the Jace McClellan versus Jamarian Miller, and then all
Yeah,
the
it's a
other
big one.
talented
Very
guys.
big one.
Yeah, it's very big because we know those guys are headed to the NFL if they get that shot as the lead back. I mean, it's almost guaranteed. It's not completely, but so that's very intriguing to me. I still expect Chase McClellan to get the opportunity this year if he can stay healthy. And then another one that's kind of under the radar is USC. I think a lot of people just assume Marshawn Lloyd is the guy. I tend to agree there. But then there's some talented young guys there. Amarian Peterson, Quentin Joyner, Raleek Brown. So I don't know if that's actually, if there's going to be a young guy who emerges as the starter there. But I guess that's an under the radar one, but not as interesting maybe as the other ones, just because Marshawn Lloyd seems like the most talented guy at USC.
Yeah, but I mean, just anybody that's going to be the starter in that offense is going to be valuable. So I get to see that as well. Wide receivers aren't as easy because I mean, just because they don't win the number 1 job or something doesn't mean they won't be on the field or anything. But I mean, is there any true wide receiver competitions that you're looking at? Like somebody's going to win this out?
Yeah. So the big ones that I'm thinking about would be the second team wide receivers for Ohio State, actually. So you're looking at Carnell Tate, Noah Rogers, Brandon Innes, all true freshmen. Or you go with the guy who's got a little bit more experience in Jaden Ballard, Keon Grays, or one of those other guys who came in last year. And I tend to think it's one of the freshmen or Ballard as far as that next guy up for Ohio State. Now we know that Fleming too he's in play, but honestly, I don't know where he slots in. I'm not really prioritizing him in drafts. I don't know. He could work out, but those other guys are very interesting to me to see who are the next guys up as the future stars in the Ohio State room. And you can even look at Alabama too. It's like, does Malik Benson as a transfer come in and supplant the guys who have been there already? Or does Corey Brooks finally step up and take even a larger share of that offense? Maybe there's something left with Jermaine Burton or the young guys like Isaiah Bond, Kobe Prentice. Like there's just so many options in that Alabama room as well. It'll be interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, my son just text messaged me and asked me if he could watch TV until 8:30. And I live in Tampa, Florida. It is 8:25. So he just asked me if he could watch TV for 5 minutes before bed, which is pretty damn funny. But uh, yeah, I think that all those freshman competitions are going to be the big ones. We talked about like Shelton Sampson before. Like if he could become the wide receiver two. It's really those wide receiver twos. And I guess I was really thinking more of wide receiver ones, but I I didn't really think of it. But like as soon as you mentioned the Ohio State guys, I'm like, wait, there's other wide receivers besides the wide receiver one. This is very true. So it's all those big name schools that have all these uh, big players like Texas, like Jonte Cook. Is he going to get on the field? Isaiah Nayer, is he going to come back from the injury to greatness and like that kind of thing? So there's quite a few players that can definitely take a big leap in value this year. Obviously, we were both really big on Nayer last year, but then it just that injury just really killed him. And coming back, fifth year player, it's never as exciting.
Yeah, I don't think he's 100% yet either, which is unfortunate, but not that surprising. And do forget the USC running back comment because I have a more exciting one for you listeners. Oklahoma running backs, actually. Javante Barnes, Gavin Sawchuk, maybe true
Oh
freshman
yeah.
Caleb Hicks. One of those guys could be really exciting because I see that Gavin Sawchuk's actually bulking up. If he's at 195, I could see him realistically getting up to 200, and he's an explosive kid. So that should be a fun competition.
I was listening to a C2C pod the other day, and they were talking about Barnes versus Sawchuk. And I can't remember which one, but one of the C2C boys is a really big Sawchuk fan, and so it was just funny listening to him. But I also like Barnes quite a bit as well. So I think that it is interesting, and I'm very excited to see who wins that job, or if it's just an outright split, which would probably hurt us for C2C purposes, but maybe is better for Devy purposes. I mean, I guess there's a silver lining everywhere.
Yeah. And Matt Bruning is the big Gavin Sawchuk fan over there. So shout out to him. And that'll be an interesting room for sure. But we can go on to the next question. We were able to cover a lot there. Thanks there, Tyler. We appreciate the question. But next up, our former co-host Duchesne's at Duchesne's underscore. Miss you, buddy. But with the history of Devy quarterbacks being volatile, Spencer Rattler, Howell, DJU, etc., is Caleb Williams a must sell in Devy? And then he also added he's currently valued about QB 10. And I'm assuming he's saying like Dynasty QB 10.
Dynasty wise,
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And I mean, I guess the simple answer is yes. Like once any player reaches that level, it's they don't become a must sell, but they become a sell, for the right price. And so there are enough people out there that will say Caleb Williams is up here, like he's that damn good. I will give you the world for him. And there's still the chance that he gets hurt, that he's just not quite what we thought, like that kind of thing. Like, I'm not wishing that upon him. I want him to succeed, but there is that chance. So, like, if someone's willing to give you the world for that, then you take advantage of it. If you can go get any of those top 6 QBs. I mean, it used to be like the top 3, but I think we're getting to the point where we can start feeling a little more comfortable about some of these other ones in Dynasty, to where you can say, okay, if I can go get even like a Justin Fields plus and like that kind of thing, then yeah, I'm taking advantage of that. Now, does that mean you have to sell Caleb Williams just because he's on your roster? No, of course not. But at the same time, I don't know that it's truly fair to compare him to like a Rattler, Howell, DJU, like that kind of thing, because I mean, Howell is just underdrafted. Like that one never made sense. Howell is a much better quarterback than a 5th round pick in the NFL draft. Like maybe somebody else, thinks that I'm an idiot, but that one doesn't make any sense to me. DJU was a very small sample size, 4 games. We fell for it. Everyone fell for it. Everyone bumped him up to QB1. It wasn't right, but we did it. That's not the same as Caleb Williams 24 games or 26 games or whatever he's played in at this point. And then Spencer Rattler was probably the closest one where he put together a great 2020 season. And maybe it was because of the opt-outs. I don't know. Like, I don't know why he was that much better that one season, but it was 12 games. And so, while it was a decent sample size and one that I would have fallen for too, it wasn't 24 games. It wasn't 2 seasons worth, or whatever. And that's why I've built that kind of stuff into my model, to where I want to see 2 seasons worth, at least a season and a half worth of good quality play before I can truly believe in a player. And I do truly believe in Caleb Williams. The other thing is, the interception rate. Even though he was pretty good, Rattler still had a higher interception rate in those 12 games, where his adjusted yards per attempt were good, his touchdown rate was pretty good, all that kind of stuff, but his interception rate was higher as well. So you can see the volatility in the prospect. So that's why I don't know that it's truly fair to say that or to compare Caleb Williams to like players like that, because Caleb Williams has been like, he has the same adjusted yards per attempt as Rattler did in his first two, or his best season. Caleb Williams has had in his first 2 seasons, but he hasn't had the interceptions. He's at a 1.4% rate. Like, he's had all the touchdowns, and he has 1,000 times more rushing yards than Spencer Rattler ever had either. So there's so many other things working his favor that I don't agree with comparing it, but I do like the fact of considering selling a player like that, because you can get a hell of a haul.
Today is a sweet day because John is just loving on Caleb Williams, and I love to hear it. But yeah, I think you have to consider shopping him, especially if you're a very active manager and you expect to, get some fruitful conversations going, because like John said, it's a no-brainer to sell him for a top-end asset that's even more insulated. So like a Justin Herbert, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes. I actually, I go back and forth. It depends what the plus is with Justin Fields or Trevor Lawrence or somebody like that. But I think that's certainly a viable strategy, a viable path. Um, Ultimately, like John said, Caleb Williams is a much more established commodity compared to some of the guys listed in the question. I think if we get a lot of takeaways from the bust rate of quarterbacks that we're projecting, maybe it's guys like last year, Tyler Van Dyke, for example. People expected that next jump. He hadn't quite had, like you said, John, enough games played, enough sample size proving that he's great, plus the change in situation that went on in Miami. Or there's other examples that you can pull out there, but it's the guys who haven't really done it yet, small, like a quite small sample size, who have that big boom bust reward versus risk. So I consider Caleb Williams, though he's a very pricey commodity, he's actually one of the safer prospects that you're going to see out there. Like, I mean, he's up there with like Trevor Lawrence amongst caliber prospects in my book. Guys who are just extremely safe. And even if he does get injured, there's going to be some sort of insulation there. Absolutely. So consider shopping him, but no, not a must sell.
Yeah, and going back to Tyler Van Dyke really quick, I mean, it was a smaller sample. That, he did look really good in a small sample. But then there was also context, like a new coaching regime came in, and I don't know anything about the coaching regimes, but you do, or other people that are smarter about college football do. And they were saying that they didn't like the new regime coming in. It was going to be bad for Tyler Van Dyke. Now, I pushed back on it and said, no, but I like the player. And it didn't work out. But guess what we're hearing now? Tyler Van Dyke looks amazing in spring practice, and like, he just looks completely different than all these other QBs and all that kind of stuff. So I think that the context matters no matter what it is. And so, like, it's not always going to be that these players are put in the best positions, because on top of that, Tyler Van Dyke lost his number one wide receiver, and his number one wide receiver wasn't even all that good. He didn't have anybody to lose, and yet he still lost his number one guy. So not to go off on a Van Dyke tangent, but I guess I did a little bit. But I think that the point is here that Caleb Williams is not at that level. He's proven himself at this point. I think it would be very shocking to everyone if he just completely fell off the face of the planet. Now, could he plateau? Of course. And that's, I guess, why I'm saying I'm willing to go ahead and at least look at deals, peruse deals to see is there something worth it there? Because if he plateaus, he's going to lose value just because he plateaued, because people are expecting him to take that next step this year. And so that I don't think he would lose, or I don't think he's going to get worse, but I don't know that I can guarantee he can get better either.
Yeah, you can't guarantee it. You're very right there. So take a look in your league, see if if the lemon is worth the squeeze there with Caleb Williams. But last question here on the docket, we have Omega, friend of the show, at Omega King 1414, another happy hour guy. We love to see that. He asks us, are there any tight ends available in upcoming C2C supplemental drafts? Question mark. And I think to end the show, we should just leave it at yes, and we can shut her down for the night. Yes, there are
All
tight
right,
ends
boys, it was
available.
fun.
You go ahead, John. I know you're the huge tight end guy. For any of the listeners out there, John can never stop talking about tight ends on this
That's
show,
right.
so I gotta let him go ahead.
That's right. The funny thing is I actually did research this time, and whereas I normally just go, it's tight end, who cares? You know, like I actually looked up some stuff. I'm actually working on a C2C model right now that's going to look at things a little bit differently than the Devy model, just because obviously for C2C purposes, we don't care as much about where they play or how big they are or that kind of thing. So I'm it's essentially the same model, but just looking at things in a different light. That's the easiest way to say it. And so I I know that Aaron gets into the recruits, and he could probably talk about some of these freshman tight ends and everything else. Tight end Beth from Toronto, Dave. That's right, baby. But I'm not going to talk about a freshman tight end. I don't care enough. I don't want to draft them. Sure, I'll look at the Campus to Canton freshman guide and maybe I'll throw a couple darts at the end of the draft if some of them are there, but that's probably the extent of what I'm going to do with tight ends. But that being said, looking at the C2C Beth tight end model, there's actually some players that stand out that are available in my draft. Now, of course, Omega is in this draft, so it's kind of hard to answer this question because I'm basically just giving him the players that I would be looking at. But I will say that the easiest one, the one that we've talked about quite a bit, Aaron especially, I think is a pretty big fan, is Bryson Nesbitt. Like that's going to be the most obvious one. He's also like one of the highest ranked in that. But we've talked about him quite a bit throughout the year. Even you've mentioned how you had him on a couple teams and things like that. I'm also pretty sure that he's gone in most leagues, or maybe not. I don't know. Is he gone in our league? I don't remember now, but regardless, I think that he would be the first one. He would be the most obvious one. The question is just going to be how early do you want to actually go for a tight end, in a C2C draft, that kind of thing. But then another one, and this could be a Devy or a C2C player, is Mason Taylor out of LSU. And I think that, like he could easily take a step forward this year. And actually they're talking about like being excited about him in spring practices and that kind of thing. But, not that Kayshon Boutte did anything amazing last year, but obviously there's one more player that's out of the offense. We talked about Shelton Sampson, how we want him to be that freshman that takes a big step forward, but we can't guarantee that either. So I wonder if Mason Taylor takes a step forward, even if it's not because he gets a larger role per se. Maybe it's just because he takes a step forward as a player in his second year, that kind of thing. What do you think about those two guys?
Yeah, absolutely. No, love the Nesbitt shout out. I do have him in one league, but he might be available in your draft there, Omega. I'm not sure. It's a 50-50 chance, I guess. But then Mason Taylor for LSU, he's a guy that I am admittedly a bit lower on. I don't see a lot of dynamic abilities. He's just not explosive, but he does have some NFL bloodline. I think Jason Taylor is his dad. I want to say like Hall of Fame player.
Ooh,
Just
okay.
I'm pretty sure, but yeah. So that's definitely an interesting guy. I know Levi Valentine, friend of the show. He kind of likes him, and I've heard some love. So absolutely keep Mason Taylor on your watch list. I was going to bring up a couple of other young-ish guys. Colston Loveland, Michigan tight end. He flashed as a true freshman this last year. Loveland was pretty efficient with the ball, and I think he's going to get a larger opportunity for sure this upcoming season for Michigan. So he's a guy I would keep in mind. And then Luke Lachey, I believe is how you pronounce his name, but Iowa tight end. You just got to wait your turn at Iowa. And finally, he's going to have that opportunity. He's flashed. I've had him rostered, or I drafted him in a supplemental last year, and I'm like, just got to wait for that stock to finally turn out. So Luke Lachey, Iowa tight end, definitely keep him in mind as well. He's another efficient guy who is a solid recruit. And he just continues to bulk up. That Iowa tight end room is it's fun to watch those guys transform their bodies throughout their years there in college for sure.
And I did just confirm that Mason Taylor is Jason Taylor's son. So yeah, we love those bloodlines there. But and I'm sorry. So I heard Luke Lachey. He is on my list. Who was the one before that?
Yep, Colston Loveland, Michigan
Yep.
tight end, super young guy. He's got a lot of upside. I think he needs to obviously develop his body, but that's true for like 90% of these guys who come into college at the tight end position nowadays. As long as they have some level of explosion, ball skills, they have the frame to put on more weight. That's all intriguing. And I think he qualifies there.
Yeah, and he's actually, I mean, it's a tier break, but he's actually the one right below Mason Taylor for me. And then you said Luke Lachey, so I guess. Oh, actually, you know what? I didn't have it sorted right. I went back to Devy. Hold on. All right, now we're here. Okay, so we got Nesbitt, Taylor. You said Loveland, right? And then Luke Lachey. So the last one that I'll talk about is RJ Maryland. Out of
I think is
SMU.
SMU, right?
SMU. Yeah, SMU. So I think that, like, it's obviously not going to be as much of a Devy play, because I don't think that I love him for Devy purposes, at least what he's done so far. But for C2C purposes, coming out of a small school, I think he had like 6 or 7 touchdowns last year. Like, he could easily be a C2C play, get you those points that you desperately need. Some of those weeks as a fill-in, and he's not overly. I don't think he's overly hyped or anything like that. I've heard his name mentioned, but I don't know that he's like truly overly hyped. But not to give too many other players, because there are some other ones that I like there, but those are like the main ones that I would be considering. The question for you, Omega, and for us is, where the hell are we going to draft them? And that's the real question.
That is always the question. But yeah, I like that shout out. Seydou Traore, guess another guy, interesting. Arkansas State going to Colorado. Who knows with that jumping competition? And another guy going up a bigger jumping competition even is Rivaldo Fairweather going from FIU to Auburn. Just an interesting guy. He's kind of a beast, but I still think he's a raw player. He's more of a very end of your C2C drafts, get you a little bit of production, maybe a shot at a shot at some NFL draft capital. I'm starting to sour on him slightly compared to where I initially had him, but I've heard a lot of love. He's been ranked as like a top 12 to 15 tight end for this upcoming season in C2C rankings, or at least CFF rankings for sure. So that's interesting. Uh, the RJ Maryland shout out is kind of funny just because he's a 217-pound tight end, but you're right. It's like, who even cares at that point if he's giving you good CFF production? Like, most of these
Right. And
tight ends are not difference makers at the NFL level anyways.
yeah, and obviously, I honestly don't even build height and weight and all that kind of stuff into the tight end model. I probably should, because I don't even have a tight end model. This is the wide receiver model, just has tight ends in it. But I will say that I guess it doesn't truly matter. I just don't think that, like, he hasn't done enough in the American Conference for me to like care, that about what he's done, per se. So that for Devy purposes, I should say, but for C2C purposes, I don't care that he's 217 pounds, because he's probably still going to continue doing what he's doing, and he's going to be just fine. But I think that's probably the most, actually, it's not even probably, that is the most we've ever talked about tight ends on this podcast.
Oh, I'm not done. No, I'm
Oh,
just kidding. No, I will give you one more, Omega, and you can
I do
actually
actually
draft.
have more. I just didn't want to
Oh.
really just talk about. I mean, I have quite a list here, so we could go on.
Also, to go back to Dirty Mike's, one of his first questions on the show, what indicator or metric? I mean, I've seen some interesting things out there research wise, just saying for tight ends, basically you want guys who have a certain amount of height, so like 6'4" or above, and you want a certain amount of weight, right? You want maybe 240 pounds or above. You also want a high yards per reception because that just shows, like John said earlier, a level of explosion, a level of athleticism from these tight ends. If you just want some just cheap ways to look at tight ends, I mean, that's a good way to screen them at least to see, are they interesting? And then you can apply context to that however you need to. Um, but those are just some ideas. But the specific name that I wanted to bring up, just as the deepest sleeper, who I actually drafted in one supplemental draft this offseason, is Holden Stays, Notre Dame tight end. And if you're going off his production last year, you can kind of forget about putting him on your board because he was a true freshman. He didn't play a lot, but he's the guy who survived injuries. And Michael Mayer is leaving at Notre Dame. There needs to be a tight end, and it sounds like Stays is competing with, I think, Mitchell for that tight end one spot. And honestly, if you go back to Stays, like he was a pretty darn good tight end in high school. He was a good recruit, high end 4-star type guy. He has the height, weight, speed, those types of attributes, and he's going to he's at Notre Dame. He's already gained the trust of that coaching staff as he started to play a little bit down the stretch last year. So, anyways, deep sleeper there for anybody who likes drafting some of these tight ends based on landing spot or based on their college pipelines. So we know that Iowa's great, right, for putting out tight ends. We think Notre Dame is also a top one.
Yeah, like you said, he hasn't done anything, so it's kind of impossible to say anything beyond. It's just, he's in a good spot. He could possibly become something. We're hoping for better things there in that offense this year, because last year was kind of a cluster. It wasn't too great. Well, I mean, you listed every other, or we listed every other tight end besides this one person. So I might as well just go ahead and name them here. I don't want to have any sleepers. I don't want to have any fun when we're drafting. So we might as well just give up all of our sleepers here. But Gavin Bartholomew out of Pitt would be the only other one. And once again, like, I'm not even saying that for Devy purposes I'm overly excited, but I guess he is kind of there for Devy purposes. But for C2C, he's right there, like with the Colston Loveland for me, like right around there. So I don't truly like hate it. It's at least an option.
Yeah, and I mean, if I wasn't so burnt out from talking about these tight ends, I could list more, but I think that's got to be it here for our
I
sake,
think so.
in our
I haven't even
drafts,
looked.
for our
Like,
sanity.
I'm assuming that Bartholomew's still on Pitt. I haven't even looked. I
Yeah,
just know that he
I
was
think
on
so.
Pitt.
And you see hype for him every year, actually.
Oh, do you
Last
really?
off season, people were super excited. It didn't quite work out, but honestly, sometimes those post hype sleepers, like people just they get burned and they get frustrated. Like, oh, I drafted that guy last year, I'm going to drop him, and then that's what I did with another tight end. Fine, fine. We'll bring up another one. The listeners will be happy. We'll bring up
Man, when did this become a tight end show?
Jalen Conyers, Oklahoma to Arizona State. Conyers was blowing up at the end of last season for Arizona State and looks good in the spring. He is a legitimate riser at the tight end position. I'm honestly not sure that he's that explosive, like as far as a NFL upside goes, but like for CFF upside, sure. Why not take a shot on him? And that's just a guy who just comes to mind when I talk about the post hype, because I had drafted him, I don't know, 2 years ago, dropped him, and then he just started to blow up this last season. I'm like, "Oh, I should not have dropped him," but that's just how this game works sometimes, right? To answer Dirty Mike's question from above, when are you out on a prospect? Never, because you see stuff like that, I guess.
Like you said, I think it's a lot easier said than done in C2C. You have 45-man rosters and all that kind of stuff, and you're able to just hold on to these guys forever and hope that they become the next Jameson Williams or whoever. But I think in Devy especially, I'm willing to get out on these guys very quickly, because Quinn Ewers, if he doesn't do it again, like I said before, like if he does the same thing this year that he did last year, he's going to be replaced and he's going to lose value. in Devy, like you have to be out. I feel like you have to be a little quicker. In C2C, it's easy because okay, well, he just moves to the back of my roster. Who cares? Oh, look, he hit. This is great. It's just so much easier. But when you have that 5-man, 7-man Devy roster, it's just so much more difficult.
So I appreciate Dave chiming in on the comments saying tight end devotional. That is awesome. And we are. So let's talk about more Caden Prescore going to
Oh
Ole
God.
Miss from Memphis. Yeah,
Just giving all the names.
you guys can look into Prescore. And I'm actually not exceptionally excited, but honestly, there are a lot of people out there who are. So for everybody trying to get that tight end content, there's another name for you to look into.
Oof. Okay, I'm worn out from the tight end talk. I didn't know that we had it in us, but here we are. We did it. After all these years, two full years of not talking about tight ends, and we did it all in one pod. I'm proud of us.
Yeah, I'm proud as well. And honestly, I've never had anything against tight ends. I've tried. It hasn't worked, and I'm glad it's finally making its way into the podcast. But it just the floodgates opened, and we're overwhelmed. So excuse us if we are in shambles right now, but that was something.
Well, I feel like it's so much easier with C2C because there's so many players that could be viable in C2C. And in Devy, man, you have people pimping like Luke Musgrave that never did anything, and stuff like that. It's just like it's so hard because all it boils down to is how athletic they are for like half of these guys. And like Zach Kuntz didn't do a damn thing in college, but all of a sudden he has a perfect RAS score and he's going to be the top tight end. And it, like, if that's all we're looking at, then we need to start getting like the 100-meter times for these tight ends or something. I don't know. Like, I guess not too many of them are probably playing track, but or in track, I should say. But yeah, I think for Devy purposes, it's difficult because honestly, like I'm sure you probably have a larger list, but I mean, if you want to, and once again, I don't have a tight end model. I have a wide receiver model that includes tight ends in it. But if you want to talk about the tight ends that like truly stand out as Devy tight ends right now, I would probably say you'd be talking about Brock Bowers and Jatavian Sanders and Brian Nesbitt. That like those would be like my three. Other than that, obviously I know that there's going to be more, but I don't know that I would truly believe or care enough about any of the other ones to say like it's not going to matter until they run the 40.
I like it, John. Good job. Good job.
All right, so that's enough of that. But actually, it was kind of different this tonight with Aaron kind of being the host there. He read all of the questions. I don't know if I like it or not. He's kind of stealing my job, but it's okay. I took the night off and it was fine. We had a good pod. Hopefully, we answered all of your questions. Like I said, I would love to get even more questions. We can send your questions whenever. It doesn't have to be for a listener mailbag. Send us your questions. We can add up and decide, hey, we'll do another one next week or the next pod. Who cares? There's nothing going on right now besides like spring practices. Who cares? Like, let's do another one in 2 weeks. So send us your questions. We love hearing from you guys regardless. If you love it, hate it, whatever, let us know. Obviously subscribe. Make sure you do all that kind of stuff. Subscribe on YouTube. We don't have nearly enough, especially for the amount of listeners that we have on the podcast. We don't have nearly enough YouTube subscribers. Subscribe there. You can watch all of our videos. I'm also posting shorts from this, so if you couldn't watch the entire thing, at least you can watch this minute or two clip, like that kind of thing. So yeah, do all that kind of good stuff. Make sure you're following Aaron. Make sure you're following me. Hopefully you are. Just listen. We love you guys. We appreciate you listening. We'll be back as soon as possible. But for now, we're going to go ahead and cash out. See you.